So to all of those people out there, a very warm welcome to this IAS lecture. And it's my pleasure, as I'm Veronica Strang, and you probably see that on my thing. I'm the Executive Director of the IAS, and therefore it falls to me to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Chris Dalglish, who is, we were just talking about his wonderful freedom in being independent, a part of an Institute for Heritage and Sustainable Human Development. And just to tell you a little bit about him, he's the director of Inherit, this institute, and the York Archaeological Trust's Institute for Heritage and Sustainable Human Development, which sounds very wonderful. And this is a charity that helps people to build better lives through heritage. So for 50 years, it's been enabling communities to realize the value of things and of their heritage. And it does this through research, education, volunteering, and public engagement programs. And it also has visitors attractions and festivals and exhibitions. So it sounds absolutely fabulous. And he joined the trust in 2017 to help establish Inherit. So you've got on one hand the kind of the trust in York Archaeology, and Inherit, which is the institute that actually enacts its research. And this new institute is expanding the trust's international reach, developing insightful research, advocating changes to policy, and undertaking community development programs. So basically it's developing the trust's capacity to work with and for people and who are maybe marginalized or otherwise disempowered in their lives, to help them to use their cultural heritage to achieve the development that they and places need. So he contributes to the Institute's UK and international programs, so currently in Southern Europe, the Middle East and China. He has a master's and a PhD in archaeology, and he's been working in heritage for 20 years or so, and also for government, in the private sector and in academia. And his interests lie most closely in the history of rural communities, landscapes in rural development, justice and land rights. You're going to see what a perfect fit he is for our project, and in heritage as a means of empowerment. So he's currently doing some research for the British Council to inform their future work in China, using cultural heritage to tackle poverty and improve the lives of marginalised groups. And then closer to home, he's been working with Community Land Scotland, which is an association of community organisations. In 2018 and 2019, this produced a major research report on community empowerment and landscape. And this was presented in the Scottish Parliament, which of course is enormously important to support advocacy for changes in Scottish law and policy. And he's continued to collaborate with Community Land Scotland and with Newcastle and Edinburgh universities through a 2-year AHRC funded network on cultures of landscape decision-making in Scotland. Now at the IAS, Chris is participating most directly in Chris Gerard and Henry Jones' project, which is called Negotiating Landscapes of Rights. And this examines the negotiation of rights around common resources in a series of case studies taken from around the world. And he will be continuing a case study from Scotland. This is a subject very close to my own heart because I work on Aboriginal land rights and water rights in Australia, New Zealand and in other places, and I have a very close interest in such rights. So I'm really looking forward to this project. So they're also going to be collaborating on inspiring rural heritage, sustainable practices to conserve and protect upland landscapes and memories. And there's a 3-year project starting in May 2020. Well, it has started really, but it will really get going a bit more firmly next term, and to promote the protection through use of upland environments and so forth. So he has lots of publications, which I won't run through, but I'm sure you've got a website with all of those, Chris. So it really only remains for me to say thank you so much for giving this lecture, and to give you the lecture title, which is Biodiversity Loss, Land Reform and Sustainable Communities. So thank you very much, Chris. Welcome everyone, and over to you.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for coming along. Before I start, I'd also like to thank the Institute of Advanced Study for the opportunity to be one of this year's IAS Fellows, and also Chris Gerard from Durham, who proposed the fellowship in the first place to me. Chris is leading with Henry Jones the Negotiating Landscapes of Rights project, to which my fellowship is attached. To introduce myself, I'm a director of Inherit, which is part of a charity called the York Archaeological Trust. Inherit is the short name for the Institute for Heritage and Sustainable Human Development, and we work with heritage as a means of empowerment. To put that another way, our work is all about people using their heritage to make their voices heard and to thrive as communities. Currently, we're working with communities and other partners around Europe, in parts of the Middle East and Eastern Asia. So we work in different places with different people, and one of the things that we try to do is to connect learning from one place with learning from another. And hopefully that will come through in the talk today. My main theme for today is land reform. In particular, I'll be talking about the empowerment of local communities in relation to the land and why I think this must be at the heart of our response to the big challenges that face us, such as the biodiversity crisis. A second theme I'll touch on is the place of culture in sustainable development. As I discuss these things, I'll draw on some of our work here in Scotland, where I am, and I'll also draw on some of the initial work that I've been doing for the fellowship. And in a sense, what I'll be doing as I talk is trying to map out some of the terrain that I'm keen to explore over the coming months with the Institute of Advanced Study and colleagues in Durham and other fellows. Let's start with the biodiversity crisis itself. Biodiversity means the diversity of life on Earth, and it's a word that's also used as shorthand for all of our planet's living organisms and ecosystems. We've known for some time that the world is facing a biodiversity crisis. In 1992, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity noted that biological diversity is being significantly reduced by certain human activities. In terms of where things stand now, 3 decades on, recent assessments, for instance, by the IPBES and the Convention on Biological Diversity have concluded that biodiversity is declining faster than any time in human history, and humanity stands at a crossroads. Biodiversity is declining at an unprecedented rate, and the pressures driving this decline are intensifying. Globally, around 1/4 of animal and plant groups are threatened. 1 million species are at risk of extinction, and biological communities are becoming more similar to each other. And all of this matters, of course, because biodiversity underpins the health of the natural world and our welfare as human beings. As WWF have put it, biodiversity conservation is a non-negotiable and strategic investment to preserve our health, wealth, and security. The issue I really want to discuss today is how we respond to this crisis. And I want to think about that issue in relation to land and land use in particular. As the IPBES has said, land use matters from a biodiversity point of view. For terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, land use change has had the largest relative negative impact on nature. Land use change is the major direct driver of the loss of both biodiversity and ecosystem services in Europe and Central Asia, and indeed elsewhere. But I don't think it's sustainable to think in isolation about the impacts of land use on nature. And this is really what I want to talk about today. Not so much about the particular land use changes that are needed, but about how we make decisions about those changes. What I mean is that when decisions are being made about how to address the biodiversity crisis, we need to ask, who has a voice in decisions about the land and how it's used? Who determines which issues are taken into account when decisions are made? Who is able to take part in using and conserving the land? Who is able to live the life they seek in relation to the land? And who benefits from the land and from its conservation and use? To boil this down, when it comes to land use, there is always a question of power underlying everything. And I would argue that empowered participation needs to be central to our response to the biodiversity crisis. There's 3 main reasons why I think this is necessary. The firstly, it's necessary to achieve sustainable outcomes for nature. Secondly, it's necessary to ensure that nature conservation promotes rather than frustrates efforts to achieve society's other goals. And I'm referring here to the Sustainable Development Goals, where we see environmental goals set alongside goals such as ending poverty and hunger, promoting good health and well-being, tackling inequalities, and otherwise making sure that people can prosper and enjoy a good quality of life. Participation is essential to all of these goals, and as the 1992 Rio Declaration puts it, for example, people need to know about and participate in decisions, particularly those which potentially affect the communities in which they live and work. And the third reason why empowered participation is necessary is that it's essential if people's human rights are to be fulfilled. The idea that people should be involved in decisions that affect them is fundamental to the human rights approach. And decisions about land are decisions that affect people and therefore require consideration of people's rights. As the Scottish Land Commission put it, land matters because we all use it and need it. The way we own and use land influences many parts of our lives. Well, let's move on now to look at how participation is currently being handled in conservation policy and practice. And I'll begin by looking at this at the global level before I turn to Scotland. In terms of global conservation policy, it's worth noting that the objectives of the 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity weren't just confined to conservation. They also include the objective of ensuring the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilisation of genetic resources, meaning resources such as plant varieties or animal breeds. More details given on this in the 2010 Nagoya Protocol, which provides a legal framework for this objective. The protocol seeks to ensure that Indigenous and local communities consent to and benefit from research and commercial activities that use genetic resources, and that also draw on people's traditional knowledge relating to the environment. On top of this, the Biodiversity Convention's strategic plan for biodiversity includes the targets that by 2020, ecosystems are restored and safeguarded, taking into account the needs of women, Indigenous and local communities, and the poor and vulnerable. And also the target that by 2020, traditional knowledge, innovations and practices of Indigenous and local communities and their customary use of biological resources are respected and fully integrated and reflected in the implementation of the Convention with the full and effective participation of Indigenous and local communities. So, standing back from all that, we can see that global conservation policy recognises the needs and interests of local communities and it promotes participation. But it does this in specific and limited ways. For example, the focus here is on Indigenous and local communities, and this tends to refer to people whose traditional knowledge and practices can be used in conservation to meet conservation goals. But what about those local communities who are not seen as the bearers of traditional knowledge and practices? Where do they fit in all of this? And in the case of the Indigenous and local communities who do qualify here, participation tends only to be considered when there's a desire to exploit people's knowledge and skills. But what about participation in broader decisions about the land and its use, in all those decisions that affect people in their lives? Well, perhaps the next global strategy, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, will push this further. The draft of it includes the target that by 2030, ensure equitable participation in decision-making related to biodiversity and ensure rights over relevant resources of Indigenous peoples and local communities, women and girls, as well as youth. The question with this, of course, as with any broadly framed policy or target, is how will it be interpreted and how will it be implemented in practice? In terms of the practice, there's been increasing recognition amongst conservation organisations of the contributions that community-based decision-making and traditional land use practices can make. Traditional land use practices refers here to non-intensive practices, those practices that have been adapted to local ecological conditions over time, and which, of course, have played an important role in shaping and maintaining the very ecosystems that conservationists wish to protect. For example, in the words of the IPBES, community-based conservation institutions and local governance regimes have often been effective, at times even more effective than formally established protected areas in preventing habitat loss. And traditional land uses and knowledge are becoming increasingly recognised for their value in solving problems related to biodiversity conservation and the sustainable use of natural resources and ecosystems. The International Institute for Environment and Development see traditional knowledge and practices as part of people's broader biocultural heritage. That term, biocultural heritage, refers to the knowledge and practices of Indigenous people and their biological resources, from the genetic varieties of crops they develop to the landscapes they create. And biocultural heritage is something that's held collectively, sustains local economies, and is transmitted from one generation to the next. It includes thousands of traditional crop and livestock varieties, medicinal plants, wild foods, and wild crop relatives. I wanted to cite the IIED's work on biocultural heritage at this point for a specific reason. I wanted to cite it because of the emphasis it places on empowerment and human development in conservation contexts. The idea of biocultural heritage is useful, I think, because it encourages to see people and their cultural knowledge and practices as having inherent value. So people are more than just another set of tools which can be used to meet institutional conservation aims. The concept also reminds us of the mutual and non-linear relationships that people have with their local environments. And it reminds us of the fact that many societies around the world see conservation values and community well-being as parts of a whole, not as something that's separate, not as competing interests. In this context, the term heritage reaffirms Indigenous people's rights over their ancestral territories and resources, and it reaffirms the responsibility to future generations. The IIED's concern here is that we're facing a double extinction crisis, biological and cultural. Biodiversity, they say, biodiversity on which humanity depends, is being lost at an unprecedented rate, and the diversity of human cultures, which has sustained biodiversity for millennia, is fast disappearing as well. And I think that this is a point that's really worth emphasising. The point that we should be concerned for cultural diversity as well as for biodiversity, and we should see the two as intertwined, again, as parts of a whole. So we face not just a biodiversity crisis, but combined with that, a cultural diversity crisis. And underlying the IIED's promotion of biocultural heritage is the knowledge that while global policy might value the contribution that communities make to conservation, this is not necessarily reflected in what's happening on the ground, at least not everywhere and for everyone. In fact, there's widespread evidence of governments and conservation organisations failing to put the principle of participation into practice. And indeed, there are some cases where people are being actively disenfranchised, excluded, displaced, and oppressed. To illustrate that point, let me take the example of the illegal wildlife trade. International policies recognise the need to work with local communities in order to tackle this illegal trade effectively. But that understanding is not always translated into practice on the ground. In the words of the IIED again, the illegal wildlife trade has an enormous impact on the communities that live alongside wildlife, but these communities can also be affected by heavy-handed, militarised responses to wildlife crime. And in terms of what heavy-handed might mean here, you may well have read the news reports that came out in 2019, and indeed, again, very recently this year, about human rights violations such as torture and murder that were carried out by eco-guards in parts of Africa, India, and Nepal. And you may be aware that international organisations like the Worldwide Fund for Nature, or WWF, and the UN Development Programme have conducted investigation into their own roles and their failings in these cases as funders and as supporters of the conservation programmes in question. Standing back and looking at the broader picture, one of the things I think we need to note here is that protected areas generally are one of the main conservation measures promoted by governments and conservation organisations across the world. But there are also general problems with this protected area model. It's a model that reflects a Western worldview that separates humans and nature, often excluding local people in order to protect biodiversity. And many protected areas are losing biodiversity and are not effectively or equitably managed. Protected areas have had negative social impacts, especially on poor and vulnerable groups, including the loss of precious land and resources for Indigenous peoples and local communities. Similarly, the IPBES have noted that protected area governance and management regimes are often characterised as top-down with low levels or quality of public participation, inflexible responsible authorities and insufficient consideration of the local context, engendering negative public perceptions and resistance among members of local communities. So here we see evidence of exactly the kind of things I was referring to at the beginning, of the need for participation, A, in order to achieve environmental biodiversity objectives, B, in order to obtain our wider social development goals, and C, as a matter of human rights in relation to people's the impacts on people of conservation measures. Let me turn now to Scotland, where some of these conclusions about the global situation apply. They apply here too, although there are, of course, differences, as there are between any place and another place. When it comes to matters of power and participation, there are two fundamental factors that I think it's important to understand in the Scottish context. The first is Scotland's pattern of land ownership, and the second is the way in which conservation decisions are made here. Let me deal with this first issue. In terms of the land ownership pattern, the majority of the land, more than 80% of it, is in private ownership. Of the rest, around 12% is in public ownership, around 3% is in community ownership, and around 3% is owned by conservation charities. In terms of that large privately owned area, it's estimated that 50% of rural Scotland is owned by just over 400 private owners. What that means is that something like 0.08% of the population owns 50% of the rural land. The Scottish Land Commission, which is a public body, has argued that this is a problem. They say that concentrated land ownership appears to be causing significant and long-term damage to the communities affected. While decisions about how to use power are made by individuals, the ability to misuse power is created by the system in which they operate. The socially corrosive effects of land monopoly occur not only because of what a landowner has or has not done, but because of what they could do. So, Scotland's pattern of land ownership is dominated by land monopolies, in which a very small minority of people decide how the land is used and for whose benefit. This pattern of monopoly control is compounded by a second issue, which is the way in which decisions are made in the public sphere about conservation. What I mean by this is the ways in which our conservation laws and conservation policies are implemented. The way in which that is done adds to, rather than detracts from, the exclusion that most people feel and experience in relation to decisions about the land. A couple of years ago, we at Inherit carried out some research on this through a project called Community Empowerment and Landscape, and we did that in collaboration with Community Land Scotland. For those of you who are not familiar with it, Community Land Scotland is a charity which serves as a national voice for community landowners here. In the research, we looked at a wide range of conservation policies and at how these are being implemented in practice. Our key finding was that there's a significant participation deficit, as we called it, in Scotland's conservation processes. This means that there's a gulf between the rhetoric of participation, which is absolutely there in our conservation policies. There's a gulf between that rhetoric and the reality of participation as it's actually practiced on the ground. The effect of this is that people feel locked out of decisions that affect their lives. And this is potentially harmful because it can undermine people's confidence, drive, and resilience, which are all things that people need if they're to pursue the sustainable development of their communities and places. The impacts of this exclusion are also not equally distributed across the country. Protected areas cover about 18% of Scotland's land area as a whole, but they are more extensive, they are more concentrated in some areas of the country. They concentrate in particular in the more sparsely populated rural and upland areas, particularly in the north and the west of Scotland, where communities are already facing multiple development challenges such as depopulation, economic marginalisation, or geographical remoteness. The issue here in Scotland is the same issue that we've seen at the global level, at least broadly speaking. While the principle of participation is now clear in our conservation policies, conservation practice continues to be shaped by a deeply embedded fence-and-exclude attitude, an attitude which seeks to separate humans and nature and to treat them as opposites or competitors. Now, I've been quite blunt about all of this because I think there's a point that needs to be made, and it's a point that needs to be made clearly. But now I've made the point, I'd like to qualify it in a couple of ways. Firstly, conservationists in Scotland have sought to work with local communities in various ways, and I'd like to acknowledge that. And again, we can single out traditional land use practices as one of the main focal points for this collaboration. A well-known example of this was celebrated in Scotland's biodiversity strategy back in 2004, which said, in the Western Isles of Scotland, a form of sandy grassland known as the macher provides a world-class habitat that's renowned for its swathes of summer flowers and breeding birds. The strategy went on to say, what's really surprising, though, is that the macher is in part created by human activity, although I suspect that wasn't surprising to those who live and work there. The strategy said, it's the crofting pattern of land use, cattle and sheep grazing, small-scale cultivation and land use rotation that ensures the macher does not revert to a simpler and much less rich habitat. At the time that this strategy was published in 2004, there was a corncrake species action plan that was being implemented by this Royal Society for the Protection of Birds and Scottish Natural Heritage, as it was called then, with the assistance of the Scottish Crofting Federation. This action plan included support for people to maintain land use patterns like the macher grazing regimes noted in the strategy that were perceived as having conservation benefits. So this is a Scottish example of the kind of support for traditional practices that we see elsewhere. Moving on from there, I'd also like to qualify my general critique of Scottish conservation practice in another way by noting that we've been seeing a lot of change in recent years. So the picture is more complex as a result of that change than I've painted it so far. We've seen some really exciting developments in land reform here in Scotland over the last 30 years or so. This includes grassroots land reform, with individual communities organising and collectively buying the land as a means of gaining greater control over their circumstances. That figure for community ownership of around 3% of Scotland that I gave earlier on, that figure represents a significant change. The vast majority of this land has come into community ownership in the last 20 years or so. And communities now own assets from small urban plots and buildings to rural estates of almost 100,000 acres or 40,000 hectares. Alongside this, since devolution and the opening of the new Scottish Parliament in the late 1990s, we've seen an institutionally driven programme of land reform as well. This has included new laws such as the Land Reform Scotland Act 2003, the Community Empowerment Scotland Act 2015, the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016. These new laws intervene in the land market by creating new rights for communities who want to buy land. The laws have created the Scottish Land Commission, which has the role of reviewing Scotland's land laws and policies on an ongoing basis and recommending further change. They've also led to the adoption of the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. And I'd like to say a little bit more about that statement because it provides a framework for land decisions, land use and land reform in Scotland, and neatly summarises, I think, the approach that's been taken to land reform now. The statement promotes a number of different things. It promotes human rights in relation to the land, as well as the public interest and well-being, and a balancing of public and private interests. It promotes sustainable economic development, environmental protection, social justice, and a fairer society. It promotes a more diverse pattern of land ownership and tenure, more community ownership, leasing and use of the land as part of that, greater collaboration and community engagement in decisions about land, high standards of land ownership, management and use, and improved transparency of information about the ownership, use and management of land. Let me pick up on the point about human rights, the first of the points there in the statement. To begin with, on Scotland's land reform journey over the last 20 or so years, discussions about human rights tended to focus on rights to privacy and property and how those rights might hinder land reform. This all changed in 2015 and 2016 when that new batch of land reform provisions were brought forward, and they promoted the idea that private property rights are not absolute. Rather, those property rights need to be balanced with the wider public interest and with the fulfilment of other rights held by all of us, including economic, social, and cultural rights. This includes rights such as rights to food, right to adequate housing, a right to physical and mental health, a right to education, and the right to participate in the cultural life of the community. All of those rights are rights that, in one way or another, link very closely with land, with decisions about land, and with land use. Now, while I think that more radical reforms are needed in Scotland, I also think that the changes we've seen so far have certainly been significant. They've begun to disrupt those socially corrosive land monopolies that I referred to earlier on, and they've created new opportunities for people, opportunities for people to create alternative, locally democratic forms of land ownership. And we're beginning to see more and more the evidence for what people can achieve when they have these opportunities and when their participation is secured through ownership. For example, recent studies have indicated the benefits that community ownership can have in relation to challenges as diverse as rural depopulation, urban dereliction, the COVID pandemic, and people's health and well-being more generally. And we're also seeing how community land ownership can enable communities to play a greater part in conservation, and as part of that, to evolve new kinds of relationship with the conservation sector. Importantly, what we're seeing, I think, is that community ownership is both helping to deliver conservation outcomes, and it's helping to deliver them in ways that meet people's needs at the same time and that fulfill their wider rights. And that includes this right to participate in the cultural life of the community that I referred to just a minute ago. Community ownership provides people with new opportunities for sustaining their diverse cultures, whether those cultures revolve around traditional land use or something else. Community ownership is also providing people with new opportunities to evolve new cultures, new ways of seeing the world, new ways of making decisions, and new ways of working and acting together. So that cultural life of the community is both about sustaining what already exists, what we've inherited from the past, and it's about creating and keeping our cultures dynamic in relation to the land. Let me finish by taking a whistle-stop tour of some examples of the kinds of things I'm referring to here in Scotland. The first example I'd like to use is Agriforestry Forest. This is an example where a community has placed nature conservation objectives high on its list of priorities for their land. Agriforestry Forest is a 1,300 acre or 540 hectare estate beside Loch Ness in the more northern parts of Scotland. It's owned on behalf of the local community by Agriforestry Forest Trust. The trust is a social enterprise that seeks to create employment in the local area while also improving the local environment and providing opportunities for outdoor learning, health and well-being, and other things. As part of this, they're undertaking a programme of woodland regeneration and replanting and creating diverse habitats through that for a variety of species. Just 2 weeks ago, the Trust won the Community Initiative Award in the annual RSPB and Nature of Scotland Awards, which gives you an indication of the kinds of recognition that community owners are now gaining for their work in conservation. Agriforestry is an example of what people can do and achieve, both for nature and for their communities, when they're empowered to do it for themselves. But I'm not arguing that communities can and should work in isolation from conservation organisations. In fact, I think one of the most interesting and encouraging developments that we've seen in recent years is the changing, and I would say strengthening, relationships that we see between communities and conservation bodies. I'll use the example here of the Western Isles of Scotland, Scotland's Atlantic west coast, because there's a particularly high concentration of community ownership there. Around 44% of the land in the Western Isles is now community owned, and some 70% of the people in the Western Isles live on community owned land. So community ownership is now the norm for many in the Western Isles. And in this changed reality, we've seen some of the biggest shifts yet in terms of the relationships between communities and conservation organisations. One example of that is the Peatland Action programme. Scotland has very extensive peatlands, which form an important carbon sink, storing something like 25 times as much carbon as all of the rest of the UK's vegetation. These peatlands also represent internationally important habitats as a kind of wetland habitat. And they, of course, they have economic, social and cultural value for people. They are part of people's cultural heritage as much as they're part of our natural heritage. And they're still actively used in many different ways. Since 2012, the Scottish Government has been funding a national peatland restoration programme called Peatland Action, recognising the significance of our peatlands as a carbon sink, but the degraded nature of many of our peatlands and the need for action to care for them so that carbon can stay locked in the ground and indeed for other benefits as well. The Peatland Action programme is administered by the National Nature Conservation Agency, Nature Scot, and it provides restoration guidance. The programme provides restoration guidance, training and funding. One of the ways the programme operates is that it has a network of project officers across Scotland who support this work. Many are located within Nature Scot offices, but some are hosted by partner organisations. And in the Western Isles, the host for the programme, the host for the project officer, is the Carlaway Estate Trust, which is a community landowner. Carlaway Estate is a community-owned estate. And their project officer, the project officer who works for Carlaway Estate Trust and is part of this wider Peatland Action network, works not just on the Carlaway estate, but across the Western Isles, both with other community landowners and indeed with private owners as well. The normalisation of community land ownership has also helped to catalyse a change in the relationships between landowning communities on the one hand and non-governmental conservation bodies. So if there's a changing relationship with government and the public sector that we see, for instance, with Nature Scot and the Peatland Action programme, we also see changing relationships with the conservation NGOs, many of whom own land in Scotland or who are active more widely. One example here is the John Muir Trust, which is a UK-wide charity dedicated to the protection and conservation of wild places. Now, by way of a little background, over the years, there's been some tension between the John Muir Trust, or the JMT for short, tension between the John Muir Trust and communities in some parts of Scotland, as well as the community sector more generally. And at the root of this tension is, let's say, different visions of the same places in the Scottish landscape. It comes about because of the JMT's advocacy of what they see as wild land. This has felt to some, this advocacy, like a denial of the history of clearance and depopulation, which has resulted in these seemingly empty places, these seemingly wild places. It's also felt like a threat to the sustainability of the communities that continue to live in these places or nearby. One person's wild place that is valued for its seeming emptiness and its seeming high nature conservation value and high presence of wildness, that for one person is another person's home, place of work, heritage, and so on. However, having said that background is there, and it certainly is, what I want to point to here, though, is that the John Muir Trust has been working with community landowners in the Western Isles for a number of years, building relationships of collaboration. And in 2019, for example, it signed new collaboration agreements with the community-owned Galson, North Harris and West Harris estates. These agreements cover things like support for conservation land management and for education and community engagement relating to environmental and conservation issues. The John Muir Trust has also been funding community projects, both in the Western Isles and elsewhere. And on occasion, it's invested in community ownership itself. A case in point here is Langham Moor in the south of Scotland. A community organisation, the Langham Initiative, has been raising funds to purchase this large area of moorland from the current owner, the Duke of Buccleuch, who is one of Scotland's largest private landowners. I think he's the second largest now. So a case in point of this land monopoly idea that we talked about earlier. The idea of the Langham Initiative is that this community purchase, will enable them to realise plans for the creation of a new nature reserve, the Taris Valley Nature Reserve. The overall fundraising target that they have is £6 million, with a target of around £4 million for a smaller option of purchase. That lower target has now been achieved very recently. And the John Muir Trust helped to achieve that by contributing £100,000 towards the total. So I raise this example just to make the point that conservation organisations like the John Muir Trust are not only funding community projects, but funding communities to take ownership of the land as well, helping to fund them at least. Another way in which we see the evolution of new relationships is the way in which some community owners have built collaborations with conservation and other partners into their very structure. An example here is the Knoydart Foundation, which owns the 17,500 acre or 7,000 hectare Knoydart estate in the northwest mainland of Scotland. The majority of the board members of the Knoydart Foundation are elected by the community, but the board also has representatives from the John Muir Trust and from Highland Council, which is the local government authority, and also from the Chris Brasher Trust, which is a charity that provides recreation opportunities for young people and those with special needs, which result from poverty or their social and economic circumstances. So you have a kind of a structural collaboration sort of built into the woodwork, if you like, there between the community, who have a majority of the board members, but then a conservation charity in the John Muir Trust, local government with the Highland Council, and the Chris Brasher Trust, which is a charity with other aims. And there are other examples like this. Just to cite a second one, the Isle of Egg Heritage Trust, which owns the Isle of Egg. Like the Knoydart Foundation, the Egg Trust has a board with representatives of the island's residents. But that board also has representatives on it from Highland Council, the local government, and from a conservation charity. In this case, it's the Scottish Wildlife Trust. Some of these collaborations between community bodies and conservation organisations are now quite long-lived. I mean, they've been going for years, if not decades in some cases. But the change that I really want to point to then is that we're seeing a lot more of this kind of thing now. It's that trend that I want to emphasise. We're going from this kind of collaboration, whether that's in the structure of an organisation or collaboration around particular programmes and initiative, or whatever it might be, those kind of one-off collaborations of good practice. We're going from that to seeing a sort of increasing incidence of new, more balanced, and I would say more effective relationships between communities and conservation organisations. It's becoming more normal. Perhaps it's not yet the norm, but it's becoming more normal. And we see this especially in those parts of the country where community ownership has become normal itself. And that's no coincidence. And this is the point that I've really been trying to make in giving you these various examples. Underlying all of them, it's the point that in our system here in Scotland, which is so heavily driven by property ownership as being where the power lies when it comes to land decisions, in that system, it's through taking ownership of the land that communities are able to create a new reality for themselves. A reality in which participation moves from being an abstract principle that's too often not honoured in practice, moves from being an abstract principle to becoming a concrete reality. And not just the concrete reality of participation, but of participation which gives people the opportunity both to help drive forward conservation, which is something that they want to and need to do, but also to ensure that this is done in ways that meet their wider development goals and that fulfill their human rights, and their human rights in the widest possible sense, of including those rights of economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as their civil and political rights in the human rights pantheon. So I'd like to end there, and thank you very much for listening. I look forward to hearing and responding to your questions and to chatting about all of this and anything that might come from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That was absolutely wonderful. I felt so at home with what you were saying, because you reminded me why I began working on human rights and ecological rights in the first place. And I so much enjoyed this very lucid disquisition about how these things work and what matters and so forth. So thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. I'm sure there's lots of questions, so I won't blather on. I have several, but I will hand over to the chat or Q&A. No, I think we're doing this via chat. So please put your questions in, and I will mediate them to Chris and everyone else, and we can go from there. Always takes people a minute to kind of absorb and start questioning.
Someone's put something in the Q&A. I'm just reading it.
Oh, okay, let's go to that. Okay. So this is from Henry Jones, and he says, this is a great, hopeful and optimistic presentation. Yes, a good question about the scalability of these examples and that question of land monopoly and changing land from commodity to resource, as you put it. How do we use a legal system that is heavily biased towards land as a commodity to be used or protected for private owners and to be financialized? Or to use Chico Mendez's well-known aphorism, environmental without class struggle is just gardening. That's very good. If law and particularly property law represents one set of class interests and land reform, sustainability and community another, where does class struggle fit into your work? Hey, there's a lovely question for you.
My word, yeah, there's a huge amount to think about there. I mean, I guess, well, maybe let me give a couple of thoughts, but I'm also conscious just looking at who's here in the kind of attending as well. I don't know if it's possible for others to jump in and speak as well, because I think we've got a few people whose names I can see who would actually have a lot to add on this. So I don't know if it's possible for people to put a hand up and come in.
We've got 100 or so people, I gather, so I think keep it as simple as possible. But if we could want to add comments to the chat to feed into it maybe, or Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to respond to what you're saying, Henry, I mean, I guess you've picked up in the tone of something I was saying, which is we have the system we have, and I suppose the approach to land reform that we've got works within that system of people taking ownership of property as a means of empowerment, as opposed to changing fundamentally that relationship with land. Although it's creating, I guess, as I said, a locally democratic approach to ownership as opposed to a sort of monopolistic or private approach to ownership. I don't know that I've thought much about how class struggle fits with in relation to this, so I don't know if I have a direct answer to that. Scalability of these examples, I mean, I suppose this is, again, is what, just to respond to that, one of the big questions, and perhaps what was behind my comment that we need more radical reforms, is that we've had land reform legislation now, various iterations in the last 20 years, building on a previous history of land reform. There are other measures in there to do with funding, for example, the Scottish Land Fund, which helps fund some of the purchases, and so on. But still, we only have around 3% of Scottish land. Scottish land is in community hands, as opposed to over 80% in private hands. So it's a very kind of, to some extent, still kind of marginal progress. So, and I suppose a gently kind of approach of not wanting to rock the boat too much. So this is what I meant by my own feeling about more radical reforms being needed to kind of break up these monopolies. I don't know quite how directly that addresses your question, but perhaps others have comments along those lines as well.
There's a couple of questions that sort of build on that. For example, Nicholas Blomling's come in with a question about Guy Shrubsole's book on land ownership, which notes that one of the major challenges is the transparency and availability of ownership data, given the lack of a land registry. And there's a kind of related question from John Paul Dunn in the chat about how community ownership was obtained in the examples that you've given.
So on the transparency issues, yes, I mean, there are issues with that in Scotland. I mean, I noted in the talk that that's therefore features in the work the Land Commission is doing, that's and in the legislation. It's not. I mean, there's not clear information on who owns all of the land, and where that information is there, getting access to it. You have to pay, and you have to be able to get that access. So there are issues around transparency, which, I mean, there are measures coming in to address these things. So there's progress there. I don't know a huge amount of detail there, so I won't try and sort of bust my way on that. But there are things going on in terms of by what means community ownership is obtained. But I think the majority of in the majority of the cases, it's a purchase, and it's often a negotiated purchase. So the private owner negotiates with the community to sell the land, and a price is paid. As I said, in the case of Langham, I mentioned, I mean, the price put on the land is between 4 and 6 million, depending on the scale of that purchase. So the private owners are paid for this. There are provisions in the law. Some communities have rights in the law which are preemptive, so they can, if the owner is not willing to sell, then under those laws there are preemptive rights where the community can try to force that, but they're not necessarily easy to exercise those rights, let's say. So mostly it's through negotiation, where there's a willing landowner.
Okay, we've got a slightly different question from Romain Gallix, which asks you for an example of Indigenous communities' successful management of mineral resources and whether this is economically viable.
So I'm just looking for this. You know, I don't. Again, I wonder if someone else, maybe you, Veronica, maybe someone else has an example there. I mean, it's not something I know much about in terms of mineral resources, Indigenous communities.
Well, they're quite rare for Indigenous ownership because usually the mineral rights are what get excluded from Indigenous land ownership rights or water rights. So, you know, it tends to remain that in places like Australia, Papua New Guinea, etc., the mineral rights remain with the Crown, and so they tend to be more privately owned. There are more examples of Indigenous management of things like previously monopoly-owned cattle stations and that kind of thing that one could look to. So there is some possibility there. And I'm also very interested in non-legal forms of ownership, you know, sort of de facto ways of owning things. I did some work with my colleague Mark Wussey in Auckland way back on property rights and appropriation. And one of the things that the anthropology discussion around this tended towards was, you know, that there's lots of ways to own things without literally having the registered rights to them. So, for example, with community action, having the capacity to volunteer and to work on land or water things is actually a way of acquiring owning. Having expertise on them is another kind of way of having de facto ownership of decision making and some sorts of rights. So I think there's quite a lot of scope for alternate ways of thinking about ownership itself.
I mean, I'd agree with that. I think one of the things that, I mean, as somebody with a sort of cultural heritage background, I mean, one of the things that really interests me is, I mean, ideas like cultural rights to land, so not legal rights, not rights of ownership, but or ownership in another sense, let's say a more cultural sense rather than a legal sense. And that's certainly something I'm intending to look at and talk to people a lot more through the course of the fellowship, for sure. So there are these other ways of considering that you have some kind of stake in or ownership of the land, and it can take many forms. But I guess the point I was trying to emphasize in relation to Scotland is that realizing participation in decisions that affect the land and that affect you without that legal standing of being the owner is, you know, it's seemingly very difficult to achieve. So the legal ownership still matters if you want to have a voice that actually carries through into decisions. But people will still feel many of these other kind of forms of ownership, let's say, So it's that relationship between the two is perhaps where I suppose my mind was going with all of that.
Yeah, so you've got some nice comments in the Q&A about the future carbon market around Woodland and Peatland, and it's clearly going to be a big discussion, and some agreement across in the chat that rights to carbon might be the new equivalent of mineral rights. And then Anna Stagner, who's come in talking about the social and jurisdictional dynamics for that kind of research that you're doing. But these are more comments than questions. I don't know if you want to pick up on them.
Yes, so I see. Hello, Grant. I see you're making the comment about the carbon market. Yeah, I mean, this is. I mean, just to mention, this is. I think this is a very important issue, and it's obviously a very current one. I mean, just to mention as a side, I don't myself have all the answers to these. I should say actually, as an aside, that I mean, a lot of the things I've mentioned today are. I'm deliberately straying beyond my kind of comfort zone in a lot of areas, because I say my background's in cultural heritage, but I think connecting all these things is very important, which is why I do that. But it doesn't mean I don't necessarily can follow through on everything in terms of detail. But in terms of the carbon market, I just mentioned in relation to that, I think this is an issue, and the extent to which communities can benefit from that is a big question. And there's some work going on at the moment actually that we're doing on behalf of Community Land Scotland on community land ownership and the climate emergency, which is a project that's just started. Not specifically looking at carbon markets, but this issue of how communities can contribute towards addressing the climate emergency, but also how they can be supported as opposed to government funds going to private landowners and so on to take up these opportunities. So I just know that, yes, I mean, the question is a big one, and it does need to be discussed and much more in the open, I think, as to who's going to benefit from these opportunities. And again, without ownership, the access to those kinds of opportunities and resources can be quite limited.
Yeah, it's obviously tapped into some really wider questions about democracy and the extent to which it's functional and genuinely democratic. I think
just that as well. I think that just one of the issues I think to do again with I think when it comes to responding to the climate emergency, this is, I think, quite a clear case to me of where things can be done on the one hand for very good reason. So, you know, planting trees, restoring peatlands and so on to for kind of climate change reasons. But depending on how that's done and who makes the decisions, that can have some quite harmful impacts on local communities. So if you've got a large private estate or a series of private estates that have a monopoly control of the area and decisions are made about how to spend funds to plant trees and to manage large areas of countryside, without necessarily recognizing, thinking about, being aware of and responding to the other issues of communities in the area, then that's when you can have some quite harmful impacts. So those things can quite easily be excluded if people aren't actually involved in the decisions.
Yeah, we've got some nice chat about the cultivation of indigenous foods, perhaps on a local and national scale, how that might address the need for community ownership. And also, I think a very sensible comment as a water person that rights and ownership should extend to marine and aquatic habitats, not just terrestrial areas.
Yes, I mean, I agree with the point about bringing in marine and aquatic. I mean, I made quite clearly in the talk there my point about land, but that's what I want to focus on. But just because that's where the extent of my knowledge is, I think. And when we get into marine environments, which in Scotland are very important, of course, as well, in terms of certain communities and their relationships with the sea, that's a big issue too. Food, absolutely. I mean, food production and consumption is very important for, again, coming back to climate change issues, but also to things like food security. And again, having the opportunity to be involved in and make decisions about how land is used clearly impacts on people's ability to produce and have access to food.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some really interesting potential tie-ins with urban food growing and allotmenteering, community gardens and all those sorts of things as well, which add a slightly different dimension to the thing. I have a couple of questions and I see nothing else popping up, so I'm going to jump in. One of them is about non-human rights, because this is an area that I'm very interested in. And my question really is whether we can safeguard human rights and community democracies without formulating and enacting some kind of vision of non-human rights and pan-species democracy.
I mean, my own feeling is, maybe it didn't come through clearly in the way I spoke in the talk, but I think we really need to be thinking in at least terms like that. I mean, I kind of, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't see the sort of human dimension and, let's say, the ecological dimension as something we need to keep apart. And it's, yeah, I suppose bridging that divide is absolutely crucial. I don't know. I mean, could you say a bit more about what you mean by sort of that idea of extending democracy beyond the human? Because that's where I kind of, I don't know myself.
Well, stop me if I get carried away. But I mean, this is more, it's partly a kind of philosophical question, which, as you imply, involves not having that dualistic separation between nature and culture. And it's partly about the kind of legal side of pushing for non-human rights. So you've got people pushing the UN to make a declaration for non-human rights. You've got a whole set of organizations trying to promote the idea of ecocide as an international crime, laws that provide rights to Mother Earth, as they have in Ecuador or Bolivia. You have, for example, in New Zealand, the declaration of rivers as persons with legal rights and responsibility, that notion of personhood being extended beyond the human. And I'm very interested in notions of imagined communities being extended beyond the human and having people speak for the non-human in a quite systematic way in river catchment management and so forth. So I could go on about that forever, but it's really more the question of equalizing power relations between human and non-human beings, to the extent that the needs and interests of the non-human inhabitants of land and river systems are articulated in decision-making processes. So does that help?
Oh, absolutely, yes. No, I think for me, I mean, just from the way, I mean, my background and the way I come at things, I think there's a link there to, I suppose, part of the reason for emphasizing the idea of biocultural heritage as a different way of thinking about things. I mean, you've got these different notions through which people try and express relationships between people and the natural environment. I mean, most commonly these days, you've got things like ecosystem services, about the services that the ecosystems provide for us, natural capital, so seeing the natural world in that sense of capital, both of which are quite sort of one-way, linear, and they kind of reduce nature to capital or to a service provider and ourselves as we receive these services. I understand why these things are used, because they're trying to make points to people who think in terms of capital and those kinds of services and functions. However, though, the biocultural heritage idea, I think, is very useful because it opens up the door to other ways of seeing the world and other ways of thinking about those relationships, which I think allows for some of the ideas that you're talking about, of somehow equalizing the power between other living things and ourselves, as well as between different human beings. So
okay, I'll come back to that point if we have time, but I've got a couple of comments here. One from Rodney Lovey about, thank you for your presentation, a point about community-owned energy projects and wind farms have been used to underpin the economic viability of some of the community land projects. And these are examples of how these are more accepted when they're community-owned. So I think that's more of a point than a question, but if you want to pick up on it. And then also a question about whether there's potential for using the community compulsory acquisition rights from the Land Reform Act in 2016, which is the right to buy land for furthering sustainable development, for acquiring land for things like woodland regeneration. Do you want to come back on either of those?
Yeah, I mean, on the things like renewable energy and income generation, I mean, that is very important. There are a number of community landowners, of course, who have who put up turbines or who have hydro schemes and other things. I think one of the point I would make there, I think the thing which is to me important is that what you've got there is a case where, okay, so the income that can be derived from something which will have climate change benefits in the case of renewables, when it goes into the hands of a community owner, can then be used for other community benefits. So there are all these links created between one use of the land, in this case for energy generation, and then other things, which could be all manner of different things depending on the community and the context. So it seems to me community ownership is a good way of making those connections and ensuring there's all these various benefits, as opposed to a much more singular land use to create income for a private individual or private family. On the right to buy for sustainable development, could it be used? I guess, I mean, again, this is one, I suppose it remains to be seen as to how easy that is to operate and put into practice. I mean, I don't know, we have some lawyers in on the call, maybe they, or some law experts, maybe they'd care to comment in the chat, but
Yes, you do also have a comment about community ownership that incorporates agroforestry and permaculture. I'm conscious we're running over time, and I want to give people moral permission to depart if they need to. But if you're happy to take maybe to deal with that question and take maybe one or two more, I'm perfectly happy to be here. So.
Me too, yeah. So I'm just reading. So this is the question about from John Paul. Thank you. Agroforestry and permaculture. I mean, if I'm reading the question right, I think maybe I agree if that's the similar point that you've got a sort of synergy or a connection between ecological fortitude, as you call it, or strengthening the ecology, and the community achieving self-sufficiency, which, again, the kinds of connections that you can make when you have a sort of more locally democratic approach to decision making, and a responsibility to the community at large for the decisions that are made, and therefore the benefits that have to be seen.
Yeah. Okay.
Final story about the right to buy for sustainable development. Yeah, so I mean, I guess that's about how we're defining sustainable development, and if the land, if you, I suppose, demonstrating that land is not being used for sustainable development, there's the many aspects to that in terms of the economic, social, and environmental benefits that accrue from it.
Okay, a final slightly left field question for you, Chris, about interdisciplinarity and how you feel that this can illuminate the work that you do.
Maybe I'm a case in point. I mean, my training, I mean, as you said at the start, I have a PhD in archaeology, and actually the early part of my professional career, I was working very much as an archaeologist. I used to go and dig holes and find things, and work for the government in heritage protection role as well. Through my career, I suppose I've been trying to reconcile that heritage interest of mine with a professional interest and academic background with myself as a sort of broader human being and all the things that I sort of care about and interested in, and which leads me to, I suppose, work now in a much more sort of cross-disciplinary way, or trying to make all these connections. And I think in relation to what I talked about today, it's absolutely vital, because what happens when you don't have that kind of dialogue and kind of learning between different points of view and different knowledges is that you end up with quite blinkered and siloed thinking, of course, which leads to people in the conservation sector. And I was one of those people in the cultural heritage side of that, going back to when I was enrolled in the public sector and so on, where you're thinking about one thing only, and that thing is whatever your primary interest as a disciplinary expert or professional are. And you're not alive to or kind of responding to all of the potential harms and benefits that go around what it is that you're doing. So to me, it's an absolutely fundamental position, is to have those dialogues and connections, and to been trying to work across the boundaries of different types of knowledge, different ways of seeing, different interests, and so on. Does that answer the question? I don't know.
Yes, no, I can see we're going to have some absolutely wonderful discussions, and I just hope that we can manage to meet up in Durham at some point. But in any case, I think I'm going to send you some stuff and test you with questions and thoughts anyway. But may I thank you for a lovely lecture. I so enjoyed it. I've been wickedly slack in running over time. Apologies, everybody who has managed to hang in there, and also to you. You might be all starving to go off and have your supper. So anyway, look forward to continuing these conversations and a wonderful inclusion of you in IAS projects, hopefully some life in Durham briefly. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I hope you found that useful. Please continue to feedback and be involved, and see you all soon. Many thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, everyone.